Graves's family have waited for this breakthrough for 5.5 years, and this morning it came, when police in Romania raided an apartment block where the man suspected of killing her was arrested.
She was bludgeoned so violently that her face shattered like porcelain. The attacker didn't just kill, he pulverized. Skull fractured, jaw crushed. The front of her head was left with a semicircular indentation, consistent with the rounded end of a claw hammer. Defensive wounds on her hand told the rest of the story. She woke up. She fought back. But she never stood a chance. This wasn't some seedy urban alley or dark city street. It happened in the heart of one of England's most peaceful seaside villages. A postcard-perfect town where crime was unheard of and doors were rarely locked. And yet, in the early hours of December 30th, 2013, 55-year-old artist Valerie Graves was slaughtered while house-sitting for friends. Her killers didn't steal a thing. They left nothing but a blood-stained bed, a broken hammer, and 1,000 questions. Who would want this beloved grandmother dead? Why was nothing taken? And how did her killer vanish for 6 years before the unlikeliest of betrayals cracked the case wide open? Today, we're cracking open one of the most baffling murder cases to ever haunt a quiet English village. A claw hammer, a picturesque coastal town, and a killer hidden in plain sight. Hit that subscribe button, grab your magnifying glass, and let's get into it. Bosham, West Sussex, an idyllic coastal village where time seemed to slow down, a place of scenic harbors, gentle tides, and elderly locals who left their doors unlocked without a second thought. But in the final days of 2013, the illusion of safety shattered with the discovery of a crime so brutal it left permanent scars on the community. At around 10 a.m. on December 30th, 2013, Valerie Graves's sister stepped into her ground-floor bedroom in the borrowed home they were house-sitting. Valerie was supposed to be asleep, but what she found was far worse than any nightmare. Her sister's lifeless legs stuck out from beneath a duvet, her face unrecognizable, her head brutally caved in. It was a scene so violent it stunned even hardened investigators. Valerie, a 55-year-old artist and grandmother, had been beaten repeatedly with a hammer while she slept. The assault was so severe that the force of the blows crushed her facial bones and fractured the base of her skull. The only clue to her final moments was a set of crushing injuries to her left hand, suggesting she had tried, desperately, to shield herself from the killer's attack. She had celebrated Christmas just days earlier. Her birthday was on Christmas Day. She'd been house-sitting the luxurious property with her elderly mother, her sister Janet, and Janet's partner Nigel, while the homeowners were away on holiday. On the night of December 29th, everything had seemed normal. A quiet evening watching TV. Valerie had gone to bed first, taking her iPad and a book to wind down. By morning, she was dead. There was no sign of forced entry, no scream had been heard, no signs of struggle elsewhere in the house. The only visible access point was a set of patio doors leading out from Valerie's bedroom. They were unlocked. The motive? Completely unknown. Nothing was missing from the house. No valuables stolen. No messages left behind. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random squatter. It was a deliberate, targeted, and savage killing. As news of the murder spread through the quiet village, shock quickly turned to panic. For the first time in decades, Bosham residents started locking their doors. Speculation ignited. Was it someone local? A family member? A random maniac? Rumors swirled, and with no suspect and no answers, everyone became a potential suspect. This was no ordinary murder. It was a senseless, calculated execution in a town unprepared for bloodshed. In the hours that followed the emergency call, Bosham transformed overnight. What had been a peaceful, postcard-perfect village was suddenly crawling with detectives, forensic teams, and reporters. Yellow tape sealed off Smuggler's Lane. News vans lined the narrow roads. Locals stood behind hedges, whispering. For many, It was their first time seeing a murder scene, let alone having one in their backyard. Detectives quickly realized this wouldn't be an easy case. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The family inside claimed to have heard nothing. And whoever had done this had left without a trace. No blood trail, no fingerprints, no murder weapon in sight. Investigators canvassed every inch of the property and its surrounding hedges, bins, drains, and gardens. The hammer, assumed to be the weapon based on the shape of Valerie's wounds, was gone. Police considered the possibility that the killer had carried it with them into the night, dumping it somewhere along the way. A grid search began. Meanwhile, suspicion began creeping in. Detectives had no choice but to begin with the people closest to Valerie. Her sister Janet, Janet's partner Nigel, and their 87-year-old mother Eileen had all been asleep upstairs. All three were questioned separately, their timelines compared and rechecked. Each family member insisted they had no idea anything had happened until morning. Nigel recalled leaving the house briefly that morning to visit a nearby farm shop, noting only that Valerie's bedroom door was slightly ajar. When Janet went to check on her sister shortly after, the horror unfolded. But something about the silence of the crime bothered investigators. How could no one hear a hammer being swung over and over again? The attack had been frenzied, brutal. Surely it would have produced noise. Had the killer known exactly where to enter? Had they watched the house long enough to know Valerie was sleeping downstairs, alone? Within days, police expanded their investigation beyond the household. They spoke to neighbors, delivery drivers, electricians, and anyone who had entered the home in the weeks prior. Contractors were asked to produce tools for inspection. Local tradesmen were questioned about hammers they owned. Even postmen and part-time landscapers were asked for alibis. Rumors took hold. Some claimed the house had been used by swingers, and Valerie was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others speculated she had interrupted a burglar. But with no clear motive, no missing valuables, and no sign of forced entry, the theories were just that. Wild guesses fueled by fear. The only certainty was that Valerie had been singled out, and whoever had done it had vanished without a sound. As detectives pressed forward, the initial momentum of the investigation into Valerie Graves' brutal killing began to slow. What started with the urgency of a manhunt was now evolving into something more haunting, a cold case in the making. And for the quaint village of Bosham, the unease only deepened. Then came a breakthrough. About 600 meters away from the house, a claw hammer was discovered, discarded near the driveway of a nearby farm. It was weathered from exposure, but still intact. Forensics confirmed what investigators feared. It was the murder weapon. Valerie's blood was present on the head of the hammer, and buried within the grooves of the handle was the faint trace of a second DNA profile, partial, degraded, and male. It wasn't enough to make a clear identification, but it was something. A thread, fragile though it was, that police could cling to. They turned their attention to the origin of the hammer. The model was a 16-ounce forged steel claw hammer, the kind found in thousands of households across Britain. But Sussex police weren't deterred. They contacted Screwfix, the manufacturer, and traced suppliers who had distributed that particular hammer in the region. Purchase logs were checked, receipts examined. The magnitude of the operation was staggering, but nothing conclusive emerged. So, investigators made a controversial decision. They launched one of the UK's largest ever voluntary DNA screenings. Every man aged 17 and over in Bosham and surrounding areas was asked to come forward and provide a DNA sample. Pop-up testing stations were set up, identification cards were scanned, mouth swabs collected. Over 3,500 men were tested. Not one sample matched the partial DNA found on the hammer. And still, nothing had been stolen from the house. Valerie's jewelry, her purse, even the electronics in the living room, everything was left untouched. If the killer had come for money, they hadn't taken a single thing. If they had come for Valerie, they had left no clear message behind. This led some detectives to re-examine the possibility of a personal motive, though Valerie's life gave them little to go on. Sussex police worked tirelessly. They knocked on every door in Bosham. They reviewed hours of CCTV footage from nearby roads and driveways, looking for unfamiliar cars or lone figures moving through the foggy night. Hundreds of interviews were conducted, over 600 statements taken. The trail remained maddeningly cold. Then came another frustration. A man was arrested. He had been living locally, worked in manual labor, and matched the general profile police were narrowing in on. But after hours of interrogation and full forensic analysis, he was ruled out completely. Police were back to square one. Years were slipping by. Despite all efforts, thousands of working hours, extensive community cooperation, and one of the most ambitious forensic campaigns in British history, Valerie's killer remained unknown. A grandmother had been murdered in her bed, in a peaceful seaside village, and no one could say who did it or why. But even as hope began to fade, somewhere, the hammer still held its secret. Behind the press conferences, DNA drives, and headlines that gripped Britain, there were real people, some shattered, some suspicious, and others hiding more than they claimed. To understand the full weight of Valerie Graves's murder, one had to examine not just the evidence, but the people orbiting her life and death. Valerie herself was no ordinary woman. At 55, she was an accomplished artist and a devoted grandmother. She had spent over a decade in Scotland, where she ran a small gallery and craft studio, building a quiet reputation for her gentle spirit and vibrant creativity. Friends described her as someone who could find beauty in the most mundane details. Waves crashing on the shore, birds perched on power lines, even the way light spilled into a quiet room. She had recently moved back south to Bracklesham Bay to help care for her aging mother, Eileen, then 87. Her life was peaceful, rooted in family, and far removed from danger. No affairs, no enemies, no scandals, just a woman living with purpose, surrounded by love. Janet, her sister, was the quiet caretaker of the family. Alongside her partner, Nigel, she had agreed to help house-sit the Smuggler's Lane property, a spacious modern home owned by friends who had gone abroad for the holidays. The plan was simple: spend Christmas and New Year there with their mother, watch over the house, and enjoy time as a family. No one expected that the cozy holiday would end in bloodshed. The family had celebrated Christmas just 5 days before the murder, complete with visitors, laughter, and Valerie's birthday, which she shared with Christmas Day itself. There was no visible tension, no arguments, no threats. On the night of December 29th, Valerie had gone to bed early around 10 p.m., taking her iPad and a book to her ground floor bedroom. Her sister and Nigel remained in the living room watching TV. The house, they recalled, was silent. The next morning, when Nigel left early to buy groceries from a nearby farm shop, he noticed Valerie's door was slightly ajar. It didn't strike him as unusual, but when Janet checked on her sister minutes later, she discovered a horror no one was prepared for. Valerie was in bed, her legs partially exposed from beneath the duvet, clearly cold and no longer alive. The grief was immediate. The suspicion followed. The hammer had given them a glimmer of hope, but that hope quickly began to dim. With no matches from thousands of DNA samples and the local community seemingly cleared, the investigation into Valerie Graves' murder began to slide into a slow and painful silence. By the second year, the questions no longer came daily. By the third, even the headlines started to fade. But inside police headquarters, detectives continued their quiet work, re-examining old files, reviewing witness statements, following dead-end tips that trickled in from across the country. The case had become a test of stamina, one that wore down even the most seasoned officers. Detectives believed more than ever that the killer wasn't from Bosham, perhaps a tradesman who had passed through, a contractor, a laborer, someone who knew the layout of the house and had assumed it would be empty for the holidays. But without a name, It was all theory. In late 2018, on the 5th anniversary of Valerie's death, Sussex police renewed their public appeal. They released a statement to the press, revisiting every detail of the crime. They reminded the public of the £20,000 reward. They pleaded again for anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. The appeal was published in local papers and picked up by national outlets. It was a quiet news week. Christmas was days away, and many families were returning to the same routines Valerie had followed that fateful year. The timing was intentional. Police hoped the emotions of the season, the reflection it stirred, might prompt someone to remember. A forgotten conversation, a suspicious comment, anything. Among those reading the appeal was a woman over 1,000 miles away, in Transylvania, Romania, Adina Marian. Adina Marian was the partner of a man named Cristian Sabu, a Romanian national who had lived in the UK around the time of Valerie's murder. They had 2 children together, and in recent months their relationship had soured. According to reports, she had grown suspicious after discovering Christian had been repeatedly searching the Valerie Graves case on Google. He followed news articles, revisited details, and then she saw something else, an image of the hammer used in the murder. It looked exactly like one Christian had owned in England. That was enough for her. Also, some sources confirmed that Christian had confessed to her about the murder. She sent an email to Sussex police, identifying her partner as a possible suspect. Back in the UK, detectives were stunned. They hadn't had a lead in years, and now a woman from Romania was claiming her own husband might be the killer. But they couldn't just take her word for it. They needed proof, and they needed it quietly. If Sabao was the man they were looking for, any sign that police were closing in might send him into hiding. Worse, if he truly was dangerous, it might put his partner or their children at risk. So, investigators made a strategic move. They worked with Romanian authorities and requested covert DNA samples from Sabu's children. It was a long shot, but it worked. The results confirmed a familial link between the children and the partial DNA found on the murder weapon. After 6 years, they finally had their man, but Sabu was in Romania. They needed to bring him back. What came next was fast, clean, and surgical. A European arrest warrant was issued. Romanian police moved in. Cristian Sabu didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't even speak much. He was calm, composed, cooperative. And when they asked him if he had killed Valerie Graves, he said just 3 words. Yes, I did. Cristian Sabu had lived quietly in Romania for years. He worked simple jobs, took care of his children, lived in a modest home. To neighbors, he was ordinary, unremarkable even. But behind that ordinary life was a secret he could no longer outrun. Once in UK custody, Sabu faced hours of interviews. The man who had once vanished into obscurity was now at the center of one of West Sussex's most haunting murder cases. And when questioned, he did not deny anything. He offered a full confession, calmly, plainly, without resistance. He told investigators that he hadn't gone to Smuggler's Lane to kill. He went to steal. Back in 2013, Sabu had been living in a caravan near the A27 in West Sussex. He took odd jobs, manual labor, metal scrap collection, and small-scale construction work. Somewhere along the line, he'd heard that the large house on Smuggler's Lane was sitting empty over the holidays. Someone had mentioned a safe inside, cash, maybe gold. So, on the night of December 29th, Sabu armed himself with a claw hammer and set off on a bicycle. He pedaled through the dark, freezing lanes toward Bosham. His destination, the house he believed would be vacant. The plan, to break in, take what he could, and leave before anyone noticed. What he didn't plan for was Valerie Graves. Sabu told police that when he crept into the bedroom, he was shocked to find a woman asleep. He panicked. His thoughts spiraled. He imagined her waking, screaming, calling for help. In that moment, he claimed, fear took over. But what happened next was more than fear. Sabu didn't run. He didn't retreat. He raised the hammer and brought it down with full force, again and again. The post-mortem would later reveal the brutal truth. Valerie had suffered injuries consistent with a high-speed traffic collision. Her skull was fractured, her facial bones shattered. Defensive wounds on her hand showed she had tried, in her final seconds, to protect herself. Sabu told investigators he struck her multiple times until she stopped moving. Then he fled, taking nothing from the house. He discarded the hammer along the road and slipped away into the night, unseen and undetected. The confession stunned police. It confirmed what they had long suspected, that Valerie's murder wasn't premeditated in the traditional sense. It was the chaotic result of a burglary gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. But what also emerged was a disturbing contradiction. Sabu insisted he hadn't meant to kill her, that he was shocked, that he panicked. Yet the nature of the attack, its violence, its relentlessness, suggested something deeper, something darker. Back in Bosham, the news of the confession spread quickly. For residents, it was a strange relief. The man who had haunted their thoughts for years turned out not to be a neighbor, not someone local. He was a stranger, a drifter, an outsider. For Valerie's family, the feelings were more complex. They had their answer. But answers do not undo grief. Sabu was charged with murder and prepared to face trial. But there would be no long courtroom battle, no denials, no elaborate defense. He would plead guilty. In November 2019, Christian Sabu stood before the court. The man who once cycled through the shadows of Bosham now faced judgment in broad daylight. He was quiet, soft-spoken. His face betrayed no emotion. The judge listened carefully. The prosecution laid out every detail, the confession, the DNA, the horror of Valerie's injuries. Sabu's defense argued that he hadn't intended to kill, that he was overwhelmed, drunk, stupid. But the facts were unshakable. The attack wasn't one blow in panic. It was a sustained assault, a deliberate effort to silence. In the end, the court sentenced Sabu to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. Valerie's family finally had justice, but not closure, not peace. Just the heavy reality that her life had been stolen in the most senseless way imaginable, by a man who hadn't even known her name. For the people of Bosham, the conviction of Christian Sabu did not erase the trauma. It simply closed the chapter that had been left open far too long. The headlines faded, the news vans left, and the quiet streets of the village slowly returned to routine. But the shadow of Valerie Graves' murder remained, etched into memory, felt in the subtle changes to how people now lived. Before the murder, Bosham had been a place where doors were left unlocked, neighbors looked after each other's homes without hesitation, and strangers were welcomed without suspicion. That innocence was gone. Valerie's death had exposed a vulnerability that the town had never considered, that even in a postcard-perfect village, evil could slip in unnoticed. Residents recalled how they'd lived for years with a quiet paranoia. The murderer had remained unidentified for so long that suspicion had touched everyone: neighbors, delivery drivers, even friends. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Some confessed they had quietly wondered if it was someone from within their own community. That fear began to lift only after Sabu's arrest and confession. And yet, what lingered was the realization that the killer had not been from Bosham at all. He was an outsider, a name none of them had known, a man who had drifted through their town, unnoticed. And for many, that was the most unsettling part, that such violence could be delivered by a complete stranger who vanished into the night. Valerie's family continued to navigate the reality of life without her. Her children, once publicly silent during the early years of the investigation, began to speak out after the trial. In interviews and written statements, they described their mother as a woman full of color, laughter, and creativity. She had lived simply, loved deeply, and gave herself wholly to her family and art. Her sister Janet, who had found Valerie's body that cold December morning, rarely spoke to the press. But in the few words she shared, she expressed the torment of discovering her own sister, lifeless in a home they had shared for Christmas. It was a burden that no conviction could ever lighten. Valerie's artwork, once displayed in galleries across Scotland, took on new meaning. Her children made a quiet decision. They would preserve it, not just as a tribute, but as a living testament to the woman she was before that violent night. Pieces of her work now hang in homes of family, friends, and private collectors. Gentle, textured windows into a life that was defined by beauty, not brutality. In 2020, a quiet memorial was held by Valerie's family in the very village that had once been the site of so much fear. A bench was dedicated to her memory, placed near the harbor she once walked, facing the open water. It bore no grand inscription, just her name and the words, "Forever loved, forever missed." For law enforcement, the case became both a badge of honor and a lesson in perseverance. It had taken nearly 6 years, thousands of interviews, international cooperation, and an extraordinary forensic breakthrough to reach the truth. Detectives reflected on the tireless hours, the mounting pressure, and the desperation they had felt as years passed without answers. But in the end, their work had delivered justice, not swiftly, but surely. Christian Sabu now sits behind bars, serving a sentence that will keep him confined for at least 2 decades. He remains largely unknown, his life before and after the murder offering few insights. There is little public interest in him now. He has no story worth celebrating, only a single, irreversible act of violence that defined his fate. Valerie's story, however, continues, not as a headline, not as a victim, but as an artist, a mother, and a woman whose life touched others with quiet grace, and whose death reminded an entire village of the fragility of safety and the strength found in truth. If this case left you stunned, imagine what's next. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another twist in the world's darkest investigations. Got theories? Drop them in the comments. We read everyone. And remember, the truth always leaves a trail,